All good? Shmuel, ready? Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. We are going to do the beginning of the fifth parak today. I wanted to start off with the first Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet 45b. Okay, I wanted to spend time on this Mishnah because this is a very, very important subject. It's been called by many commentators as the most comprehensive topic in all of the Talmud in terms of the ramifications and the definitions and the various applications that it holds. And that is the topic of Bereirah, okay, which we can call in English designation or selection, depending on the situation. So the beginning of the chapter deals with a case that we're very familiar with. This is a continuation of the previous parak of two people who, again, make nedarim against each other. Okay, these people are still making nedarim. That hasn't changed yet. And the Mishnah starts off by saying, Hashutafim shenadru hana zeh mizeh asurim likanes lachatzer. Two partners who own a common chatzer, a common courtyard between the both of them, and they each made neders. Okay, Reuven basically said that he can't have any benefit from Shimon, and Shimon said, touche, well, I can't have any benefit from you or from your property. So they each can't benefit from each other. So that means that according to the first opinion of the Mishnah, okay, they are not allowed to go into a jointly owned courtyard. Okay, now the first question you may ask is, well, is this considered benefit? I understand if I said you can't have any benefit from me, and then the next day I see you swimming in my pool. Okay, that is a major violation because you are benefiting from my property. Okay, you are you're having fun at my expense, right? It's my pool and you are having hana. Or if you're doing something else, okay. However, if you're just walking through my yard, okay, we've had this discussion before a number of times in the last week or two. That's something called vitur. Okay, vitur is defined by the Gemara as what we would say something trivial, right? If I say you can't have any hana from me, and I see you Shabbos morning running through my backyard as a shortcut to go to shul, right? It took about 3 seconds. Do I really care that you went through my backyard for 3 seconds? So I'd go on a limb to say that 95% of people would not mind that. That's not considered benefiting, okay? If you are doing something else, if you're in my house, if you're eating my food, maybe that's a different story. But something as minuscule and as trivial as just traipsing through my backyard, then that is not something that I'm going to really care about. However, apparently, this Tana argues and says that it is absolutely usur, even something as minuscule as what we call drisa, which is drisas regel, which is just going into the yard. So the first opinion of the Gemara of the Mishnah says that because we made nedarim against each other, so when you go into the yard, every step you take, half of it is mine and half of it is yours. So you're having benefit 50% on my account. So that's why the Tanna Kama says it is forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov argues, and he says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, no, I disagree. Okay, first of all, there's nothing wrong with walking into a yard. Second of all, okay, I'm helped by this concept of Bereirah that says, well, who's to say that this is my yard, right? Or your yard. You walk into the yard, you can't get a benefit from me, but the truth is, maybe you're really not on my property. Because it's jointly owned, today is my day. Tomorrow can be your day, okay? So therefore, we don't look at it like every single square centimeter is jointly owned, because then you're right. Every step, every footstep, you have half one partner, half the other partner. We bifurcate it and basically say that it's split, okay? I own it one day, or I own it a certain time, and each time the partner goes in, he could say, now it's all mine. And we don't look on the molecular level at every square inch and say that it's all mixed together. Okay, so that is the beginning of the Mishnah. So the reason why this Mishnah gets a lot of notoriety, in fact, this is probably, I'd go out on a limb to say that this is the most famous Ron in all of Nedarim. Okay, the reason is because if you look at this page, it's so small. The reason is
can I ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
What happens if you don't know that somebody has made such a neder? Like,
if you don't know, then you can't, then nothing. Then you don't know.
But is it like trespassing if it's private property, or?
Well, most people should, I mean, in terms of crossing through backyards, it depends what the minhag is. Meaning, if this person is known to mine, then you should probably ask, or just let him know that you're doing it until he tells you no. Or if he's an easygoing guy and he lets people go, then you have nothing to worry about. Your question is if you don't know, like, what do you do?
Yeah, but so then assuming that you know, what is the benefit if you just step into the property?
So if you're talking about in general, if you don't listen to, if let's say someone has a no trespassing sign and you go anyway, that's not considered a sin, so to speak. Okay? The only reason why we're talking about these isurim is because you're breaking a neder. Once you break a neder, that's a lav. It's not a lav per se. It's not nice. It's not civil, but it's not one of the 613 that you're violating if you just go through someone's yard who has a no trespassing sign.
Okay, but what's the benefit? What's the benefit if you just step in? What
The
is
benefit
the benefit?
is that it's saving you 5-minute walk. That's a benefit.
Okay.
That could be one benefit. And in the case of partners, this guy does work in his right. The Mishnah goes on to say that they used to put up, millstones, and they used to grind, and they used to raise chickens and do whatnot in their chutzah. Today, our chatzerim are not really meant to do serious work. They're more to lounge out in the sun. Back then it was a serious thing where they would do work and all kinds of things. So when these partners made a neder against each other, that meant that one of them, couldn't do his work properly. So.
Okay. And then it talks about it in the Gemara, but this was part of my like confusion on this, is if you're partners, if you both have ownership, then how can you prevent somebody else who owns that property or whatever from benefiting from it?
Because what you're doing is you're not telling him that you're usser. You're telling him that you can. You're basically telling him that either I can't any have hana from you, okay, or you can't have any hana from me. Either way, in general, that means that you can't drive him to work, you can't play with his kids, you can't play basketball together, whatever it is you can't do. One of the things you can't do is have him walk into this jointly owned field, because that's called vitter, that's called hana, believe it or not. Doesn't sound like it, but it really is in the Gemara's version.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So what I was saying is, what's ironic about this is that if you look in the Gemara, the Gemara doesn't use the word Bereirah at all. The Gemara assumes that you have already learned Bava Kama, where this exact Gemara is brought down. Okay, but before we get to Bava Kama, I just want to I would like to read just the beginning of the Ran, then I want to shift to the Gemara in Bava Kama. Okay, so if you look at the Ran is on the third wide line on top of the Ran. The second word of the line, it says, Ubeperak Shor Shanagach Esapara. This Gemara is actually brought down in Bava Kama. Ukimna Pluktayu B'yesh Bereirah or Ein Bereirah. So the Ran, first of all, introduces the fact and says, well, you're not going to find in this Gemara in the Dorim what the Svaras HaMachlokes is. You're not going to find out what they're arguing about. You have to have remembered it from Bava Kama. Okay? Now, if you're doing Daf Yomi, we haven't done Bava Kama yet. So that could be a problem, unless you did last cycle and you remember from 6 years ago. But anyways, so let's look at the Ran. And the Ran says exactly what we just said. Yesh Bereirah o Ein Bereirah. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer Savar, Yesh Bereirah v'haydel nafshi ka'ayil, v'haydel nafshi ka'ayil. If you hold of Bereirah, and I'm going to explain it fully in a second, of this concept, then basically you view it like, hey, I'm going into my part, you're going into your part. We don't view every square foot as like a checkerboard, right? And I have a domain and you have a domain and I can't step in the wrong place. No, I imaginarily break it up and it's not combined. And I designate an area as mine. I'm allowed to take that. I'm allowed to take a mixed property and I'm allowed to bifurcate it into my section and your section. That's the expression, Haidel nafshi ka'ayil, b'haidel nafshi ka'ayil. Okay, and the Rabbanan saver ein Bereirah. And the Rabbanan say, we don't hold of this concept of Bereirah, and that's why you can't play this trick. So now you're seeing at least what Bereirah means. Bereirah means that right now we have a problem. Okay, we have a problem because when we entered into this partnership, okay, we bought this property together. Okay, and I didn't know exactly, which part I own, which part you own. We were friends, we got along. And when two people own something jointly, then they both use it. And if things go great, then there's never any contention and no one's nitpicking over time and place and who gets what area, right? Everybody plays well in the sandbox together, right? And they're not arguing about who has this sand and who has that sand, if you want to look at it that way, right? Now, even though when they bought this, they didn't know exactly what the schedule was going to be, but now we could fast forward a year now that they're fighting and say, oh, this is what I meant a year ago when we bought it. I could use it here on this day, and you could use it here on this day, even though a year ago we really didn't know. That designation of doing something, what we call post facto, is the exact definition of this kind of Bereirah. And I say this kind of Bereirah because this is a very confusing topic where we have different subclasses of Bereirah. But before we get into the confusing part, I want to learn this Gemara in Bava Kama. This is, I think, the second week in a row, or we did Bava Kama a week or two ago, right, when we learned about Mavriach Ari, okay, which was a couple of weeks ago. If you remember the case of the animal falling onto the tomatoes, right? Remember that? I think that was on Daf Nun Ches. So today we're doing Daf Nun Aleph in Bava Kama. If you have a Bava Kama in front of you, there's a very short Mishnah on Bava Kama 51. It's a similar topic than we're doing in the Darim. It's not talking about two partners who own a courtyard together. It's talking about two partners who have a pit, okay, who have a well, let's say. And I have a well, right? We're 50-50 partners. And the Mishnah sets up the case where we know when it comes to bor, which is one of the avos nezikin, right, in Bava Kama, bor is basically you dig a pit, a well, right? You take water out of it. It's a hazard. You have a responsibility to cover the pit and to make sure that there's no hazard in the walkway. If you leave it open, then you're liable for whatever damage it causes. Okay, that's basically the principle of bore. So what if you have a case of a pit, of a bore, of a well that's owned by two partners? Okay, the first one uses the well and he doesn't cover it. And then the second one uses the well and he doesn't cover it either. And then an hour later, an animal falls in there and breaks his leg and dies. Okay, so which one of the partners is liable? So the Mishnah says that the second one is liable. And the Gemara goes back and forth. And the Gemara brings down a related topic. The topic is, we are on 51b, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th wide line on the bottom. Okay, Kitanoi. Hamadla Mayamin Habor, Ubachavero. So here you have two partners. Okay, you have one partner goes and uses the pit and takes off the cover. Okay, and then he leaves. He says, okay, leave it alone. The partner says, now you've had it for an hour. Now let me use the well to get my water out. And don't worry about it. I'll cover it. I'll take care of it. Okay. So as soon as, so the Gemara says, the first person, when he leaves, when he says, okay, now is your responsibility, right? He passes the baton over to his partner, and the partner takes over. And now the partner leaves it uncovered. So the Gemara says, well, he's liable. Okay, as long as the first person leaves when the second partner is doing it. So the first partner is now no longer liable. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says he disagrees, and he says Mishayim Sarlo Dalav. Okay, hold on one second. Let me just bring this up in Sefaria.
So,
Yes.
so from an American point of view, you could have a suit against both of them, or the first one, and then the first one could interplead the second one.
Right. He could say, well, it's kind of his fault also.
Because they both are owners and both actually liable.
Correct. So getting back to over here, excuse me one second. I lost my place. Oh, okay. So what does Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov say? Again, the first opinion says that what? That when Shimon, the second guy, comes and says, leave me alone and I'll draw the water. Okay, so once the first person leaves and he sees a second person, Shimon, using it, that's it. He's no longer liable. Okay, if something were to happen. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, no. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says the first person is not potter yet. He's only potter until he actually gives his bucket to Shimon, the second person. That's called Mishayim Solo Dalav. The first person, Ruvain, has to make a move and physically give over the cover because he started. Okay, so because Ruvain started this, he just can't say, okay, Shimon, it looks like you know what you're doing. I trust you to cover it. Reuven actually has to give over the cover to Shimon. So the Gemara says, what are they arguing about? So the Gemara says, what is the source of their argument? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Yesh Bereirah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, well, I see over here, there's something called Bereirah, meaning that what? This situation, which we just said a few minutes ago, where it's a situation in which the beginning we didn't exactly know something, but only later we define what we really didn't know. So how in the world does this work with a water? So the Gemara explains, Hi mididei kamamala, v'hai mididei kamamala. In this case, what are they partners in? They're partners in the water, right? They each own half of the water. So the water is considered divided between Reuven and Shimon even before they actually draw it. So when Reuven comes and he draws it, he fills from his parts. Now we know that all the molecules are mixed together. So this is in theory, because it's impossible to say, well, this is my water, this is your water, when it's all mixed together. But in a Talmudic way, like we always like to do, we separate it and say, well, Reuven has his water. So when he fills it up, he's filling up his parts. Okay, we don't know where his location is now, but after he fills it up, he says, oh, that was his location. And Shimon, the second one, is filling from his location. So as long as the first partner didn't give over to Shimon, right, the cover, right, he's an owner of the water, of his part of the water. So therefore, he's still not patur from any future responsibility if something were to happen. Okay, that's called selection. You have your water and I have my water. But says the Rabbanan, the Rabbanan say, no, Rabbanan saver ein Bereirah. The Rabbanan say, no. All the water is mixed. So therefore, as soon as the second person is left alone, okay, after Reuven already left the scene, Shimon's drawing his own water, he's responsible for all the water, right? Because we don't say, well, we split up the water. No, he's responsible for the whole water. So therefore, right, even if the cover wasn't given to him, we still pin it on him. Okay, and the words of Rashi in Bava Kama says regarding Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, v'lo havilei sheni shoal al chalko sharishon. It getting back to the first, right? Getting back to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rashi says v'lo havilei sheni shoal al chalko sharishon shehi akulo mutav alav l'shamro. It's not that he's responsible, right, on the whole thing. Hilkach im hizik shnehem chayavin. And if something were to happen, Rashi says they're both equal partners, even though it happened on Shimon's watch, after Reuven already finished with the water. But the point is that once I give you over the cover, right? Once I give you over the cover, then Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov views you as a shomer. You are now guardian, you're responsible, right, to make sure that you cover it well. Okay? So you see the same concept of, well, do we view it like it's everyone's water mixed together? Or do we say, no, it's not that we're all mixed together. I have a part and you have a part. And that whole discussion is very similar to exactly what our discussion over here is in Nedarim. Now, there's an interesting point that the Shitu Mikubetzes brings down in Bava Kama, because the truth is, and this is where I already warned you that it's going to get a little confusing, because the Shitu Mikubetzes says that the word Bereirah over here is a little different. He says, Perish Bereirah de hachalav ka Bereirah de alma. This Bereirah in Bava Kama is not exactly the same as any other Bereirah. Because we're not saying that, oh, after I split it up, the water, well, that's the water which I really wanted from the beginning. Because water is something that's not really physically able to split up. Okay, there are things, and this is why it's a little confusing, is because there are things that can be split up. and there are things that can't be split up. Okay, for example, one of the other two applications that the Gemara talks about where we have the concept of Bereirah is a Yerusha. Okay, a father dies, he leaves over sons, and now he's got a whole estate, and there's going to be a time, there's a lag time from when he dies and when the brothers actually acquire their land. First of all, you're going to have fighting, you're going to have lawyers, you're going to have this, you're going to have that. It's going to take a long time before each of the brothers are settled in their new properties. So the question is, if this takes 6 months, okay, how do you view the ownership in the first 6 months? Okay, father died in January, and in June, they finally get to settle. So June, they're settling. But who owned the property from January till June? Well, they didn't really know that what they were going to own. But with Bereirah, we allow this mechanism to say, well, January, we weren't sure. June, we were sure. So because we were sure in June which brother is going to end up owning which house, so it was retroactive back to January. That's a very quote unquote simple case of Bereirah, where something was unknown and it became known, but it's something that is able to be split up. Another example is what is the case. We have the Gemara, I think this is quoted in 7 times in Shas, where a person has a barrel of wine and he doesn't have measuring cups. Okay, and he doesn't know how much truma to give, how much meiser to give, and he wants to drink the wine. So he's allowed to take the wine, drink it, and then leave some over and say, well, let me pour out. And then when he finally gets his cups, he says, well, let me pour out for the Kohen and let me pour out for the Levi, and he gives his truma and his meiser. But a day ago when he was drinking all the wine. So each ounce, technically a tenth of it belonged to the Kohen, and a tenth of it, or a ninth, whatever, without getting into the fractions, belonged to the Levi. So he's drinking that, and usually you're not allowed to do it. But when it comes to Bereirah, I could say, well, this is what I really meant, right? So this is a little bit like the water, right? How do we take the water and split it up in an equitable way, so that the Kohen has and the Levi has? Okay, so that's a case of Bereirah that you could split up. Then there are things that you can split up, like, for example, water. You can't, right, the case in Bava Kama, you can't split up the water. Like, it's impossible. They own a well, and you get permission, and I get permission. But that doesn't mean that there's a physical separation between my water and your water, right? Or even the case in the Durham here of the Chotzer, right? Each square inch, one belongs to me and one belongs to you. I can't really split it up. So that's why the Rishonim say, even though the Gemara uses the word Bereirah interchangeably, okay, there are cases that don't exactly match each other. And then, just to confuse everybody, there's another case of Bereirah, okay, where that involves items that not just split up, it has nothing to do with splitting up. It's just something that needs clarification, right? If you remember, we had a Mishnah in Nedarim, in Eruvin, right? I think it's on Daf Lamed Vav, where the Mishnah and the Gemara talks about that a person right before Shabbos hears that his Rebbe is coming to town. So he's all excited, but he's a certain distance away. And we know that on Shabbos, you can't walk more than 2,000 amos. So when you make your Erev Tchum, you're granted another radius of 4,000. You could double the 2,000. The problem is he doesn't know which direction he's coming from. So if he puts it in one direction, he could go further, but if he goes in the other direction, then, right, then maybe he loses out. So, and he can't go 4,000, right? You're allowed a radius of 4,000, but depending on where I put that extra 2,000, I could get 2,000 from there, but I can't go backwards from my home start, right? So what do? So he makes a condition. He says, well, I don't know where the Chacham is going to be tomorrow. So he puts one in this location and he puts one in that location. And he says, whichever one the rabbi is going to go tomorrow, that's the one that I chose today. Well, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So when Shabbos comes, he's allowed to borer, he's allowed to, quote unquote, designate and select his Eruv, even though on Friday night, when it triggered, he wasn't able to choose because he didn't know. So that's a third kind of Bereirah. Okay? And that's just a background. That's just like the tip of the iceberg when we're dealing with situations of Bereirah. I want to read the Ran. Okay, the Ran is about 3/4 of the way down. The Ran basically deals with the problem why the Gemara over here seems to paskin like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov that Bereirah works, okay, which means that the partner could go in, okay, because I'm going, this is my field today, and you could go in another day. It doesn't violate the neder. The problem, the Ran says, is that the Gemara in Beitza paskins that we only say Bereirah when it comes to a Rabbanan, not a D'oraisa. And this is a D'oraisa concept because if you, in fact, break the neder, then that's a Torah violation. It's not a rabbinic violation. So the Ran goes through many, many different opinions. And the bottom line the Ran says is that Lefichach, I'm about 20 lines from the bottom. The Ran says, Lefichach nirin li dvarim kepashtan, de Bereirah dahacha ke Bereirah da alma, ele mishum dahach Bereirah adifa. So the Ran comes up with a revolutionary chiddush in the field of Bereirah, and he says this is what he calls a super Bereirah. Okay, what does that mean? That he says, Paskiran hacha Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. We in general hold like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Mihu hachanami anu tzrichen leBreirah. We need Bereirah over here. The igloi milsa lemafreira keBreirah da'alma. Mishum deleka lememer ahai chatzer kulei damar ukulei damar. Right? You can't say that this guy owns it, right? Because the ilamar lav damar, the idamar lav damar. You can't have it both ways. Either I have it all or you have it all. So elahachi ka'amrinan sheshutfim halalu b'shasha lakhu hechatzer. So his point is, he says the reason why this Bereirah is different because when these shutfim got together and they opened up their LLC together, okay, and they bought this property jointly owned, aldas ken lakhuha. That's exactly why they did it, because they didn't know which day was going to belong to who and which area was going to belong to whom. So therefore, the deal was, when it's your day, you do it. I don't know what day it's going to happen. I don't know whether I'm going to have Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, or I'm going to have Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. I don't know yet. We'll play it by ear. But the bottom line is that when it's my day, I could use all of it. Because we don't know the exact schedules, we may not know the schedules, but we know that there's no suffix that they both own it. And that's what his punchline is. His punchline is that because we know that they both own it, that's not a suffix. When it comes to a Bereirah, like for example, the case of the case of Shabbos, where he puts his Eruv, he doesn't know at T1, we'll call it, which way the Chacham is going to come. He knows at T2, but at T1 he doesn't know. But here, these partners know that they both own it. It's just a schedule problem. Which days do you want and which days do you want? That's why the Ran says, we need the clarification. Anu tzrichen leBreirah lomer she'achshav echad mehen mishtamish ba. One of them is using it, so therefore, Hurver hadavar lemafreya shemisha rishona kana osa kula l'shazu. So retroactively, when we bought this a year ago, I'm using it Tuesday at 9 a.m. So that's what I meant when we bought this a year ago, that this is my hour. Okay, so that's why the Ran says that this Bereirah is not as bad as all the other Bereirahs when we don't know at T1 who is going to have ownership. So because we know for sure, that kind of evades that suffix, and that's why this Bereirah is different than all the other Bereirahs. Okay, so it goes on and on much longer. I don't want to bore everyone to death. It's just that I feel that when you learn Nedarim, this is like one of the top 2 or 3 just general yedias wise sugyas that I think we have to know, at least for Nedarim, and also obviously because it appears many times in Shas, and you should all have at least a slight grasp on that topic. All right, I wanted to move on to the Mishnah on Daf Memches. Okay, we're still talking about neders. All right, we got another 2 weeks of this. I'm sorry. Okay, so here you have a case. This is the Mishnah on 48a, about 2/3 of the way down. The Mishnah says, you make a neder against the guy, right? Reuven said, neder, Shimon, you can't have any benefit from me. The next day, they're traveling together, and he sees that Shimon is really hungry. And just as Reuven was about to feed him, he says, oh my God, I made this neder. And of course, he can't get out of it because there's no chacham there to do ataras nedarim. So he's stuck, right? On the one hand, he wants to help a Jew. On the other hand, they had a little tiff together, and he really can't feed him. So what do you do? So the Mishnah advises, they have to find a third person. All right, they have to go find Levi. And Reuven says, Levi, here, take this loaf of bread, okay? And he winks at him, and Levi goes, okay, I got it. And then he gives it to Shimon, okay? So obviously this is not recommended, but this is a circumstance where the person, would like food. Not that he's dying, because if he's dying, that's a whole different discussion, right? If someone, right, the Gemara in Bava Metzia, right, hopefully we'll get to in about a year and a half, that discusses, right, the 2 people in the desert and there's one canteen. Right there, there's no sharing. Right there, your life comes before. All right, so that's a different discussion. But here, this is not life or death. So what you do is you find the third party, and Reuven can't give it to Shimon directly. So now we had, I think last week, a case where he leaves it on a rock and he's mafkud, right? If you remember the case of Hefker, he says, I have food over here. I hereby declare it Hefker. I abandon it. It's ownerless. Whoever wants to take it, take it. And that's the cue for Shimon to go in and take the food. So here, what happens is he gives it to Levi, and that's fine. Now the Mishnah brings a story. The story goes as follows. Maisa be'echad bebeis Charon. There was a story of a family in Beis Charon. Shahaya aviv muder b'menu hana. Okay, so you have 3 generations over here. Okay, so v'haya meisiya et beno. You had a grandfather, a father, and a son. Okay, a happy family. The problem is the grandfather and the father had a neder on each other. Right, so the grandfather said, right, to the son, right, the grandfather said to his son, in this case the father, right, we'll use Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov so that there's no confusion. So Avraham and Yitzchak, right, the grandfather and the father, okay, Avraham made a neder against Yitzchak, Vayaben meisiat beno. Yitzchak was marrying off his son Yaakov. Okay, so Yitzchak obviously wanted to invite his father Avram to the wedding, but he couldn't, right? Because he had a neder on him. So what did he say? Right? He said, you know what? I can't have my father come into my yard, right? Because I made a neder against him. So he can't take in my son's wedding. So I got an idea. You could have my house, you could have my yard, right? And by the way, don't get all excited that you're about to be a proud owner of a new mansion. I'm doing this because there's a technicality. I made a neder against my father, and now he can't go to his own grandson's wedding. So it's going to be very, very embarrassing. They're going to talk about it all around town. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give my house away. So if it's not my house, right, this sounds like what? This sounds like selling the chametz, right, to the rabbi, like everyone thinks we do, right? Just get rid of your chametz for a week. It's not a problem. And then when you come back from Florida, you get your chametz back, right? It's obviously not that simple, but here is a similar case where he wants to give away his house and then get it back after the wedding. So the question is, does this plan work? Now, what he does is he actually tells this person, unrelated, he says, I'm giving it to you so that my father could come and enjoy the wedding party. So Amar, so this guy was a wise guy, all right? This third party, right, who was about to take over the house for the day, right? He's a wise guy. He said, oh yeah, you're giving it to me? I hereby make it hegdish. Mm-hmm. So Amrle Nasati Lacha Shalisha Taktishim Shamayim. He said, hold on a second. You made my house hegdish? That wasn't the point of this little plot. So Amrlo, so the guy responds, Nasata Li Shalach Elishetiya Atav Abicha Ochen Bishotin Umisratzin Zalazeh Bahaya Avon Toli Baroshi. He goes, that may have been the plot, but your whole thing didn't make sense from the beginning because I'm very well aware why you gave this to me. You want to pin the blame on me. You want to get out of your neder, right? You want to you want to have your cake and eat it too. You want to get out of your neder, have him come to your grandson's, right? Have him come to his grandson's wedding. And meanwhile, I'm the fall guy over here because it's going to be on my head that I'm allowing this little shtick to go on. So the Mishnah ends off by saying, Amru Chachamim, Kol Matana She'ena. This kind of a present like this, no. You can't give a present to someone and say, well, it's yours, but there's strings attached. When you give something away, the whole point of it is it's the recipient's, and he or she could decide to do whatever they right, whatever they want to do, right? You can't have this game where you give it to them, and if they want to make it hegdish, it won't work. So the criteria is it has to be what we call hegdishable, okay? Meaning that the recipient now has ownership to the extent that if he wants to donate it to the Beis HaMikdash, he can. So here in this wedding, it's not going to work because you can't give an outsider your house just to have your father come to a wedding, and meanwhile, the guy can't mock the shit if he wants to.
It's all.
Yes.
I don't know, but maybe somebody else sees this problem too. It seems to me there's two different issues here. One is the ownership of the house and the benefit of being in the house. The other was the having the wedding and the benefit of being at the wedding. Aren't those two different things?
They are, meaning I can't, if I make a neder against my father, then he can't come to my house, period. Right? Like we had before. He's off limits on my property. So therefore, he'll be missing out on a wedding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but isn't he still getting a benefit of going to the son's wedding?
No. The benefit is being in the house because he had no problem on his grandson. It was his son that made the neder on it, right? In this case, it was, right, Yaakov has nothing to do with Avraham, right? The problem is Yitzchak.
I think I understand that part of it. It seemed to me that with respect to the father and the grandfather, the father-son relationship, the net between the son and the father, or the father and the son, the problem is that there's still a benefit. If
the only benefit is being in the house.
Third person, Isn't he still bestowing a benefit?
No, it's indirect. I hear what you're saying, but it's still indirect.
Okay.
Okay, so why am I reading this Mishnah? Because this Mishnah is related, believe it or not, to a similar Gemara we have regarding something completely different. Okay, let's go back to Maseches Sukkah. Okay, there's a concept called Matana Almanas Lahachzir. I give you a present, and the condition of the present is that you have to give it back to me at some point. Now, why is this in Maseches Sukkah? Because there's a very famous discussion. The Gemara is on Daf Sukkah, it's on 41b. Okay, the Gemara says that there's a story with a bunch of Tanaim where they're on a boat, and one Tana gives back to the other Tana, and the Gemara happens to say in passing that one of the things we learn from a story of these Tanaim on a boat is that when it comes to giving a conditional present, okay, meaning, well, there's a story where Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Gamliel were on a boat, and Rabbi Akiva returned the lulav to Rabbi Gamliel, okay? And the Gemara says, well, he returned it to him because if someone gives you something, you have to give it back to him, okay? And Rashi in Kedushin even says that if I make a deal that I'm going to give you a present for 3 hours, and if you don't give it back to me, then it's not considered a present, and he doesn't give it back, that's actually considered gezela. Usually I think of gezela as if I pickpocket you, if I take something. But what if and I think we mentioned this a few weeks ago, what if I just don't return something that you gave me? If I'm a shomer and I'm watching something for you, and I decide not to return it, then I steal it. It doesn't necessarily mean I go into your account and I take it, or I go into your pocket and I steal your change. If I hold on to something for too long, that's also considered gzela. So the Gemara over here says, Amar Rava, Hey lecha esrog zeh al menashe tachziruhu li. I say, here's the deal. I know you need an esrog, and I happen to have a nice one. And because you don't have one, I say, take this one on condition that you give it back to me. So the Gemara says, Nitalo v'yatzabo, if I take it, and I'm yotze the mitzvah of esrog, then hechziro yatsa. If I, a minute later, give it back to the one who gave it to me, retroactively, this is a little bit like Bereirah, I'm only yotze the mitzvah of the esrog if 5 minutes later I give it back. What if lo hechziro? What if I take the esrog, I make the bracha, and I say, you know what, I like this esrog so much, I want to keep it. It wasn't his. So the Gemara says lo yatsa. He did not fulfill his obligation of esrog because, well, we know why he didn't fulfill it, because what he did was he actually held on to it for too long. So the Gemara over there in Sukkah Mem Aleph, so the Gemara in Sukkah says the following. Let me just open it up. Tosfos has a question because Tosfos knows our Mishnah in Nedarim. Okay, so Tosfos asks the following question. We're on 41b in Sukkah. Gemara says, Tosfos says, V'im tomer kivin da'amar almanas shetachziruli imken imikdishu enu makudash. Remember what the Mishnah Nedarim says? Mishnah says that it has to be something that's hekdishable, or else you don't really own it. The definition of ownership is, remember the house in the wedding? You could only call it your house if you could be makdish it. If the guy who gave it to you says you are not allowed to be makdish it, then there are strings attached, and it's not considered a full acquisition. So Tosfos asks, if that's true, in our case of the lulav, because he says on the condition that you give it to me, you can't be makdish the esrog because the guy wants it back. So how could it be considered yours to be yotze? That's Tosfos's question. How come How come it works by a esrog, but it doesn't work by the house in the Darim by the wedding? So, right, and he brings a kasha. He says, "Im ken hech yatsa v'hatran ben Darim perakashutim gabe matanas the base choron the kol matana she'enu shemikdish lo tiyeh mikdeshes lo." So the Gemara says, so Tosfos asks the question, and Tosfos answers. He says. The second answer, Mishani Masnisin Kol Matanashi Kamatnas Beis Charon Shahaisa Ba'arama. What was the problem with this Mishnah? This whole thing was a subterfuge, right? He only gave it over to this foreigner, right? Because he needed his father to come to a wedding. So Tosfos says that goes under the condition of arama. That's called a trick. I'm giving this house to you. I'm renting it for you for a day. You can't have any hana. I just want it out of my name, just for a few hours for the wedding. So that's a joke. That's what Tosfos says. It doesn't count. How could you think for a minute that counts as a good gift? Right? Tosfos says, that's not considered a matana. Here, why am I giving you this esrog? I'm giving you this esrog because I know that you weren't Mekayim the mitzvah of esrog yet. So I'm doing a favor. There's no favor in the Darim. He's not giving over the house to this guy as a favor. By the case of the esrog, he's giving it over as a favor. Right? Okay. Anyway, so that's exactly the distinction Tosfos says between the esrog and between the case in the Darim. So it's interesting when there's a discussion in the commentators about this concept of matana almanas lahachzir, and the discussion is, well, how specific do you have to be when you give over this esrog? So the Rush in the back of the Gemara in Sukkah says, you have to give it over and as on condition that he gives it back. Right? You have to give it back. And it's interesting, you're only yotze them, and this is what we said before, you're only yotze the mitzvah of esrog when you give it back. Then it clicks. What if you talk too much and say, here's an esrog, I hereby give this to you to be yotze only because you don't have one, and then it becomes mine. So that's a long speech you give. If you give too much, what we call today TMI, if you give the guy too much information, then the Rush says, Lo yatsa, bo dahavi kamo sha'ul. So it changes from a matana to something that's borrowed. So there's a fine line over here. If I give you a present for a few hours, you could say, what do you mean a present? Why is this any different than a case of if I borrow it? What if I don't have an esrog, right? You remember the old days in Poland in the 1700s, right? That's why the Gemara is talking about this, right? Every town had one esrog, right? And everybody had to go and give it, and right, no one has esrogs, right? Right, all these stories we hear about they were lucky if they had one or two esrog, and they had to pass it around. And that's how they were yod to the mitzvah. So someone's going to say, well, it sounds like, we used the word before, harama, subterfuge. What are you doing? You don't have one. So you're not giving a matana on the condition to return it. You're just loaning it for an hour. So that's what the Rush says over here. He says there's a very fine line between a loan and a gift, right? So the Rush says if you give too much information and say this is yours only for a few minutes and then you have to give it back to me, that's considered a loan. All right, so that's why the Rush says you have to be careful to say, take it and give it back to me. That's it. Don't say that it's only on condition, right? You don't talk too much. Okay, there are other opinions that disagree with that. But that at least is the opinion of the Rosh. So how do we paskin lamaisa? Right, being I just said that this nowadays we don't have this problem because everybody has their own esrog. But the Shulchan Aruch and the Aruch Chaim actually says that this works. I'm reading from the Shulchan Aruch in 658. Okay, Taf Reish Nun Ches in Hilchas Sukkah. Nasnulo al menash lahachziro. If I give, right, if I give over the esrog on condition that it be returned, hareze yotze bo yidei chavaso, then this person is yotze his chiyuv of esrog umachziro, but he has to return it. Shematana al menas lahachzir shema matana. Okay, because this is in the category of matana al menas lahachzir. V'im lo hechziru lo yatsa. And if I don't return it, the fact that I shook the lulav and esrog 10 minutes ago, that gets disqualified. Why? Because it's not mine. And the Shulchan Aruch now has a great chiddush. Ready for this? He says, "Afilu nasan lo es damov." What if he's after 10 minutes of shaking, he says, I like this so much, here's $100. So you might think, wow, of course he's Yotze because now it's his. He says, no, you can't pay for it because the guy didn't want to sell it to you. This was a matana. So even if you reach into your pocket and give the guy $100 for it, it's still no good. Okay? Says the Shulchan Aruch, right? Similar, right? Even if this was due, even if it was done under duress. Similarly, what if he took it for so long and returned it after the mitzvah was over at night? There's no mitzvah at night. What if he took it so long and returned it when the mitzvah was no longer existent? So then we say he is not Yotze the mitzvah. Okay. And it's funny, the Ramah adds, Umutur lasei slo esrog b'matana al manah shelo yaktishena. So now he quotes Aaron in the Dorim. He says that it is permitted to give an esrog on the condition that it will not become hegdish. Why? The logara mimatana al manas lahachse, because this is no different than giving a gift on the condition that it be returned, right? You can't make it hegdish, so therefore the same thing is true with a matana. So the Ramah actually brings home this rule about not being able to mock the shit. All right, so we had two topics from the Durham, and I guess I did want to talk a little bit about Rabbi Akiva because his story appears, but we discussed it a few months ago back in Ksuvas on page 63. So we don't have time now to talk about it. But all right, I guess that is all for tonight. Any questions?
Yeah, Batsal,
Sure.
it occurred to me